My name is Adeline Ashford. I am 35 years old, and for most of my adult life, my family treated me like a person they were merely generous enough to tolerate. I was the useful one whenever bills arrived, and the invisible one whenever seats were counted at dinner tables. Then came that fateful Tuesday morning. My stepmother, Constance, sent a message at 7:14 a.m. while I was pouring cereal for my 2 young sons. The text was simple, cold, and calculated. Plans changed. You and the twins aren't coming. Your sister wants only real family on the cruise. I read those words once, then again, the screen's light feeling strangely harsh in the morning kitchen. The twins were sitting at the table in their bright pajamas, asking me with genuine excitement if they could bring their little blue backpacks on the ship. I set my phone face down on the counter with a steady hand before they could see the tremor in my fingers. I didn't call to beg. I didn't cry. I simply reached for the life I had been building in secret for 2 years. By noon, the quiet, recurring payments that kept my family's lavish lifestyle afloat were cancelled, and the house they all resided in, the house they assumed was their eternal birthright, was officially off the market and under new ownership. When their plane finally landed, the first thing they saw wasn't a word from me. It was the sold sign planted firmly in the yard. That sign had taken me exactly 2 years to earn the right to plant, but it took only a single morning to finally use. But the sign isn't where this story begins. It begins with a house on Gull Point Road in a town called Wexford Harbour, and with a little girl who was taught, very gently and very effectively, that she was merely a guest in her own family's history. The key to the Ashford house was always heavier than any key I owned for my own home, and I felt that physical weight every time I let myself in through the side door. It was a Sunday in early spring, approximately 3 months before the planned cruise. I had driven over to sort the mail, because the mail, like every other administrative burden, was always mine to manage. Property tax notices, the quarterly insurance renewal, a hefty invoice from the roofer, who had patched the north gable back in February. On Gull Point Road, where the Ashford house had stood since before Wexford Harbour even possessed a yacht club, a name on a mailbox was considered a legal verdict, and everyone in town already knew exactly which Ashford I was supposed to be. My stepmother, Constance, was sitting in the sunroom, nursing a cup of high-end coffee. She didn't bother to turn around when I entered, she never quite did. "You're so good with the boring, tedious parts, Addie," she remarked to the window, her voice dripping with a practiced, casual condescension. I set the roofer's invoice on the growing pile of bills I would inevitably be paying. $3,200 a month was what it took to keep that house breathing, the taxes, the insurance, the persistent dampness in the basement. I had never once dared to say that number out loud to her. I just paid it. I paid it the way you keep paying for a service you're still desperately hoping will eventually learn to love you back. There was a slim, cream-colored folder resting near the coffee tray, bearing a lawyer's return address on the flap. I recognized it instantly. I reached for it without thinking, the way you reach for your own coat. "Just leave the trust papers, dear," Constance said, lifting the folder and sliding it under a heavy garden catalogue. It was a movement as smooth and practiced as a professional card trick. "Those are family things. I left them. That was the shape of my life for 20 years. I paid for the house and stayed grateful for the scraps of belonging I was tossed. And the papers about the house were family things, while I remained something adjacent to family, close enough to be handed the bill, but far enough that the word real always seemed to land just past my reach. In my coat pocket, my fingers found the little silver acorn my grandmother had pressed into my hand when I was 6 years old. It was tarnished, dark, almost black in the seams, and it was warm from being constantly carried. I didn't know then why it mattered so much. I only knew it was the one thing in that massive, hollow house that had ever felt like it was actually mine. The doorbell rang precisely at noon. My sister, Blair, burst in from the front, arms laden with expensive shopping bags, followed closely by an interior decorator, and the house immediately filled with the kind of manic, entitled noise that made it perfectly clear whose home this was. Lunch was set for the family. Constance took the head of the table, Blair took the chair on her right, and there was a folding chair brought in from the pantry closet, awkwardly angled at the far end near the sideboard. That folding chair was for me. It always was. Nobody announced it, you simply learned over the decades exactly where you Saturday. Family sits up here, sweetheart, Constance said when I paused a half-second too long by an empty seat that actually had a cushion. She smiled, a look that didn't reach her eyes. You understand, don't you? I carried my plate to the folding chair. The sharp metal edge of the chair cut a cold, stinging line across the backs of my thighs, the same way it had when I was 15, 25, and last Thanksgiving. Halfway through the meal, Constance said, apropos of nothing, we Ashfords have always kept the important things in the blood. She was looking at Blair when she said it, the way you look at a polished trophy. Blood is blood. You can't manufacture that. She said the word blood 4 times over one lunch. I counted, because I had spent 20 years counting. At the time, I thought it was just a standard brand of cruelty. It would be months before I understood it was raw, unfiltered fear. After the plates were cleared, the doorbell rang again, and it was Alistair Vance. Mr. Vance had been my grandmother's attorney for over 30 years. To the rest of the family, he was just a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke, the dull lawyer, perceived as harmless and best gotten rid of quickly. He declined the offer of coffee. He stood in the front hall, with his hat in his hands and a heavy envelope tucked under one arm, finding me where I was drying the serving dishes so I wouldn't have to sit back down at that table. Adeline. He waited until Constance drifted out of earshot toward the sunroom. When you're ready, we should talk. Not them. He held the envelope out, and his eyes were steady, fixed on mine. You? I dried my hands on a towel. The name on the envelope was mine, written in my grandmother's elegant, slanted hand. She was very specific about you, he said, and then he put on his hat and left the house. I stood in that hall for a long time, holding an envelope I hadn't opened, in a house I paid for, and did not own the story of. I opened it that night, reading a single line in her hand, telling me to come and see Alistair when I was ready, and to come alone. I told myself it was probably nothing. It was not nothing. But before I tell you what my grandmother had been keeping for me, I have to take you back much further to the first time I learned there were 2 kinds of Ashfords, and that I was the second kind. Every autumn, when the great oak on the front lawn dropped its acorns, my grandmother held what she called the pinning. It was an old family tradition. Each Ashford child received a little silver acorn to wear on a collar, or a coat, polished bright. The pinning meant you were one of them, rooted, belonging. I was 6 the year I remember most clearly. There was a card table on the grass, a velvet cloth, and a row of silver acorns catching the light, all shined to a mirror-like finish. The other children, my cousins, second cousins, faces I have mostly forgotten, went up one at a time, and were pinned with a bright one. When it was my turn, Constance was the one holding the tray. She looked at the shining acorns, and then she reached into her cardigan pocket and took out a different one. Dark, old, tarnished, nearly to black. "This one suits you better, Adeline," she said, and she pinned it to my collar in front of everyone. Somewhere behind me, a great-aunt murmured that Blair, up next, was such a true little Ashford. I held that dull, ugly acorn in my fist all afternoon until it warmed. I remember thinking it was the ugly one. I remember being certain the shine was the point, and I hadn't earned the shine. I would carry that same dark acorn for the next 29 years without ever once suspecting the truth about it. That is the thing about a lie told to a child, it doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like the weather. There was one person who set a different weather for me, and that was my grandmother, Winifred Ashford. Winifred was small, straight-backed, and terrifying to almost everyone. And every Sunday of my childhood, she pulled the chair out beside her own and patted it, and that chair was mine, no one moved me from it. While the adults talked, she would take me out to the oak tree with a paper bag, and we would gather acorns off the lawn, and she would teach me how to sort them. "Every acorn on this lawn came from this one tree, Addie," she told me once. I can still feel the rough cap of one between my thumb and finger, the way the shell had a faint ridge you could trace. She turned an acorn over in her old hand, and then she looked at me for a beat too long. "I always know which are ours." I thought she meant the acorns. "You belong here," she said, closing my fingers around a good one. "More than any of them." I thought she was being kind. Grandmothers are supposed to be kind. I filed it under kindness and I didn't hear it. Not really. Not for 30 years. My mother, Rosalind, was not there for any of it. She died in June when I was 3. I have exactly one clear memory of her, a scent, lavender, and something underneath it. And a hand smoothing my hair back off my forehead. That is all, a scent and a gesture. The rest is a hole where a person should be. There were almost no photographs of her in that house. The ones that survived were always pushed to the edges of the frame, half-cropped, as if she had wandered into the shot by accident. I used to stand in front of them and try to build a face out of the pieces I was given. My father, Edmund, was alive until I was 25, but for 22 years, I waited for him to say one particular sentence about her. I would get close to asking. I'd catch him alone in his study and say something small. Did he remember what she was like? Did he think I looked like her? And I'd watch him start to answer. His mouth would open, and then Constance would appear in the doorway with a tray or a question, and my father would close like a door easing shut. "Your father just wants peace, Adeline," Constance would say, warm as anything, steering me out. And my father would say to my back, "Later, sweetheart." Later never came. He died with the sentence still unsaid. I didn't yet understand that a man can be silent for reasons that have nothing to do with his nature, and everything to do with what he is afraid to look at. There is one more memory from that house, and it is the one that mattered without my knowing it. I was 19, home from school, and I found Constance at the dining table with the family Bible open in front of her, the big one, with the lineage written in the front. Generations of Ashfords in fading ink. She had a pen. She was, she said, tidying it. I looked over her shoulder. I was already the kind of person who noticed records. I would make a career of it. I saw that a line near the bottom had been gone over, thickened, and that my mother's name sat cramped and small in a margin, while another entry had been given room to breathe. "We keep the record tidy, dear," Constance said, and closed the book. I remember something else from that table, and it took me half a lifetime to understand why my eye snagged on it. It was a small, framed photograph of Blair as a baby, propped by the Bible. I looked at that baby, at the round face and the coloring, and some quiet part of me thought, she doesn't look like any of us. I told that part of me to be quiet. Blair was a true little Ashford. Everyone said so. The child in that photograph matched no one in it. I just didn't know yet what that meant. By this spring, I was 35 and I had a life of my own. 2 boys, a small house across town, a job I was good at, reading the paper trails of the dead. And still, when the family gathered, I was the folding chair. The cruise was Constance's idea. 10 days, a big anniversary of nothing in particular, the whole clan sailing out of a port 2 states south. The day before they flew down to board, there was a send-off lunch at the house, and I brought the twins because I had not yet learned to stop hoping. The dining room smelled of lilies and the ham Constance always ordered from the same shop. Relatives filled the good chairs, a dozen of them, aunts and cousins, and a couple of yacht club friends who had somehow become family by proximity. Blair had her cruise wardrobe half unpacked across the sofa, holding dresses up to the light. My son Theo asked in the clear, caring voice of a 7-year-old, whether the ship had a pool. "Oh, this one's just for real family," Constance said lightly, folding a dress over her arm. A few of the relatives laughed the way people laugh at something they've decided not to examine. An aunt, Diane, one of the kinder ones, glanced at me and then at the twins and said, "Are you 3 coming down for it?" Constance answered before I could. "The boys would be bored, wouldn't they?" She smiled at my sons like they were furniture that might scratch the floor. All that grown-up time. I put my hand on Theo's shoulder. I could feel the small blades of him under my palm, and I kept my hand there, steady, so that the steadiness would go into him instead of the other thing. Before the lunch broke up, someone suggested a photograph. It was the last big gathering before the ship, and Blair wanted a picture of everyone on the front steps under the oak. The relatives shuffled out into the light, and began arranging themselves by height and by habit. Constance placed people the way she always had, with the ease of a woman who has never once doubted her right to decide where people stand. She put Blair at the center in the good spot on the top step. She tiered the aunts and the cousins around her. And when the frame was full and the light was right, she turned and held the camera out to me across the gravel with a smile that never for 1 second considered itself unkind. "You've got the steady hands, Addie," she said. So I took the picture. I stood on the grass I paid to have cut, and I looked through the little screen at my whole family arranged on the steps of a house that was, though not one of them knew it, mine. And there was no place in the frame for me, and none for my 2 sons. And I pressed the button and the shutter clicked and it was done. "Perfect," Blair called, already turning away. "Send it to the group." Theo tugged my sleeve while I was still lowering the camera. "Aren't we in it?" he whispered. And he wasn't upset, only puzzled. The way you're puzzled by a rule you haven't learned yet. "Next time," I said. It was the same word my father had used on me for 22 years. Later, next time, a word shaped like a door that never opens. And I heard myself hand it down to my own child on the same lawn where I'd been handed it. And something in me went very quiet, and made a decision it did not tell me about until the following morning. I said we'd see. I helped clear. I took my boys home and put them to bed and told them the ship story was still being decided, which was true in a sense they didn't need to understand. The next morning was the cereal, the twins in their pajamas, the little blue backpacks, the box of cornflakes in my hand, and the phone lighting up on the counter. You already know what it said. I read it once and then again, and I set the phone face down, screen against the counter, before two small heads at the table could look up and read my face. "Eat up, boys," I said, and my voice came out completely level, which surprised me, because inside my chest, something very old had just gone very cold and very quiet. The phone rang 20 minutes later. Constance. I stepped into the hall to take it. She was warm. She was always warmest right before she wanted something. "Let's not make a scene, Adeline." A little laugh powdered over the words. "You always understand." There it was again. Understand, the word they'd been handing me my whole life. The way you hand a dog a job so it'll stop looking at you. "I do understand," I said. I understood more than she knew. But she didn't know that yet. And I wasn't going to be the one to tell her. "Enjoy the cruise," I said, and I hung up. Here's where I'll stop and ask you something because I've told this story enough times to know it's the moment people lean in. You're standing in that hallway. Your mother has just cut your children out of the family and called it real. She's on a plane in a few hours, out of reach for 10 days. What do you do with those 10 days? Hold your answer because I promise you, whatever you're picturing, it wasn't what I did. The screen of my laptop threw a pale rectangle of light across the kitchen table where an hour earlier, there had been cereal bowls. I opened the account that paid for the Ashford house, then the one that covered Constance's car, then the small monthly transfer that had for years quietly closed the gap between what that family spent and what that family actually had. Because the Ashfords were the kind of old money that was long on name and short on cash, and the difference had a face, and the face was me. I cancelled them one at a time. Cancel. Confirm. Cancel. Confirm. People assume old families keep their money in vaults, ours kept it in me. Somewhere along the way, I had become the quiet machinery that held the Ashford life level. The club dues that came every quarter, the standing order at the wine shop, the line of credit Blair thought of as her own, the payment plan for surgery 2 winters back that no one had ever mentioned again. I had said yes to all of it, one small yes at a time, because each yes had felt like a rung I could climb toward finally being real. I unclimbed the ladder that morning, one tap at a time, and every account I closed gave the same soft chime of confirmation over and over, like a small bell ringing in an empty church. There was no drama in it. My hand didn't shake. That's the part people never believe. It was the calmest thing I'd done in years because for the first time in my life, I was doing something instead of enduring it. Then I made a call. It rang twice. A man answered. A private buyer I'd found the previous autumn. A quiet person who restored old shore houses and paid cash and asked few questions. "It's Adeline," I said. "We're ready." A pause on the line. "You're sure?" I looked out the window at nothing. "I've been sure for a while." That's the sentence I want you to hold onto because it's the true one. I had been sure for a while. The buyer wasn't a decision I made that morning over a text. He was a door I'd built the previous fall and left standing, hoping I'd never have to walk through it. That morning, I walked through it. We agreed on terms in under an hour. A sign would go in the yard by that afternoon. The papers would be signed by noon. Then I went upstairs to my sons and I became a different person for them, softer, ordinary, a mother on a Tuesday. "We are going on an adventure," I said, pulling their good jackets from the closet. The smell of new packing boxes already in the hall from the ones I'd started folding the night before when I couldn't sleep. Theo looked up from stuffing a dinosaur into a blue backpack. "Is this an adventure, Mom?" "The best kind," I said. My throat did something then, just for a second, and I turned it into a smile. "Bring the acorn." Jonah, who is 6 minutes older and takes everything seriously, held up the little tarnished acorn charm I'd left on the dresser. "This one. It's kind of ugly." "It's the most important thing we own," I told him. And I zipped it into the front pocket of his backpack, where it would be safe. I packed the boys first, and then I packed the only two things in that whole life that were truly mine. The acorn was already zipped into Jonah's backpack. The other was a single photograph, the one clear picture of my mother, Rosalind, that had survived Constance's tidying. A small square print I'd rescued years ago from the back of a drawer and never dared to frame. In it, she is caught mid-laugh, half-turned, not pushed to any edge, whole. I wrapped it in a dish towel and laid it flat in the top of a box so nothing could bend it. Everything else could stay. The furniture, the silver, the portraits of Ashfords who'd have called me a guest. I took my mother, and I took the acorn, and I took my sons, and I understood, smoothing the towel over her face, that those three things were the entire inheritance I had ever actually wanted. We were in the car by early afternoon. I drove past the end of Gull Point Road once, slowly, and looked at the Ashford house in the rearview mirror, the great oak, the north gable I'd paid to fix, the sunroom windows. A man was already carrying a real estate sign across the lawn toward the flower bed by the gate. People think leaving means running. Sometimes it means you finished first. I didn't cry on that drive. The boys sang along to something in the back and the town got smaller behind us, and I felt the strangest thing, which was not triumph and was not grief. It was quiet. The quiet of a person who has stopped waiting. Because here is what none of them knew, as their plane climbed toward the sun and their ship waited at the dock. I didn't do any of it because I was angry. I did it because 3 months earlier, an old lawyer had handed me an envelope and I had finally learned what my grandmother had been trying to tell me my whole life. To understand how I could sign those papers by noon without my hand shaking, you have to go back to the morning Alistair Vance sat me down in his office a few weeks after he'd handed me that envelope in the hall and opened a folder that changed the shape of everything behind me. His office smelled of old paper and lemon polish. There was a box on his desk, a small cedar box, honey-colored, with a brass clasp, and beside it, a stack of documents squared to the edge of the blotter. He didn't reach for the box first. He reached for the papers. "Your grandmother did her estate through a living trust, not a will," he said. "Do you understand the difference?" I did professionally, but I let him say it because I could tell he needed me to hear it the way she'd meant it. "A will names heirs. It goes to court. It becomes public and it can be fought." He slid a recorded deed across the desk, turned so I could read it. "A trust already holds the house. It doesn't wait for a court, and it holds it." He tapped the line with my name on it for you. "It has since the day she died. 2 years, Adeline." I looked at my own name on a deed to the Ashford house, dated the month my grandmother was buried, and the floor of the room seemed to tip very slightly. "They live there," I said. "They live there by her grace, not by right." He folded his hands. She gave them a license to stay for 2 years, because she didn't want to put them on the street the week of her funeral. That license ends this June. He let that sit. They were guests. You were the owner. You have been the owner the entire time you were writing those checks. I had known and I had not let myself know. I had signed a paper in a grief-blurred week 2 years earlier, and filed the knowledge somewhere. I didn't have to look at it because looking at it meant becoming the person who could make my family leave. And I was still even then hoping to be let in, not hoping to lock a door. There's more, Vance said. The house is separate. The rest of the estate, the Ashford legacy, what's left of the holdings, is still in the trust, waiting to be distributed. And your grandmother put a condition on it. He met my eyes. The remainder goes only to Ashford descendants by blood. And before it's distributed, the trustee is required to verify the line. Verify how? Documentation. And if there's any question, he said it very evenly, testing. He told me the date the trust would settle and the legacy would be paid out. The final distribution, the verification, all of it fell on a single day this coming June. Why that date? I asked. Vance turned a page and pointed, and something in his careful face softened, and he said, your grandmother chose the date herself. June the 10th. The room went quiet in my ears. That's my mother's day, I said. That's the day she died. He nodded slowly. She said the whole thing to your mother's day. I asked her why once. She said you'd understand when the time came. You'll understand why. My grandmother had been saying it to me my whole life, from a card table on the lawn to a chair pulled out beside her own, and I had heard it every time, as a grandmother's kindness. I was only now beginning to hear it as an instruction. And if the verification finds a problem, I said, because I read these instruments for a living, and I could already feel the shape of what she'd built, the legacy can't pass to a claimant who fails it. It can't, Vance said. The trustee is bound. Not me, not a court, not 30 relatives in a room. No one can hand it to someone the line won't verify. He held my eyes. Your grandmother wanted a kind of power that couldn't be argued with, so she tied it to blood, and blood doesn't negotiate. Then Vance slid the cedar box across the desk, and the metal clasp was cold and small under my thumb, and I opened it. The hinge gave a soft complaint, the way old wood does, and the smell that came up out of that box was the smell of her cedar and dried lavender, the exact scent of Sunday afternoons when I was small. And for a moment, I was 6 years old with acorns in my pockets and a straight-backed woman deciding I belonged. Inside was a single folded letter, my name on the front, and I unfolded it and I read it in her slanted hand, slowly, because I could not have gone quickly if I tried. My Addie, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And Alistair has done exactly as I asked, which means you are sitting somewhere quiet, with a box that smells like my kitchen. I want to tell you a thing I could never prove and so could never say out loud while I lived, because a woman with no proof, and a loud accusation only burns down her own house. You are mine, Addie. You always were, and one of them never was. I watched your father raise a child that carried none of us in her face, and I held my tongue, because I loved him, and I could not take the ground out from under him with nothing in my hand but a grandmother's certainty. So, I did the only thing I could. I built a door that only real Ashford blood could ever open. And I set the lock to your mother's day, so that when it opened, she would be part of giving you back what was taken. The little acorn I pinned to you when you were small, the dark one they laughed at, it is not tarnished. It is only old. It is the first one, Addie. The one all the shiny ones were cast from. I gave you the original and let them wear the copies, and not one of them ever knew the difference. Sit in the chair by my window. It was always yours. And Addie, you read bloodlines for a living. Ask the question you already know how to ask. All my love, and no more silence. Grandma. I sat in that office for a long time. Alistair Vance did not rush me, and he did not speak, and outside his window the ordinary street went on about its day. When I could, I folded the letter along its old creases and put it back in the box, and I put my hand flat on the lid. And I understood that my whole life I had been carrying the real thing in my pocket, and being told it was the lesser one. I drove home from Vance's office with the cedar box on the passenger seat, and a single sentence running through me like a current. Ask the question you already know how to ask. I did know how to ask it. It was, in fact, the only thing I had ever truly been good at. I read records for a living. Give me a name and a date, and I can walk a family back through a century. Pull the vital records, the census lines, the church registers, the little administrative crumbs people leave behind them without meaning to. My grandmother had spent her life watching me do it, and had left me a letter that amounted to a case file. So, I opened the case. I started where she told me to look, which was the face. I laid out every photograph I had, the family shots, the cropped ones, a stack of prints from Vance's box, and I did the cold, clinical thing I'd have done for a client. I traced features across generations. The Ashfords had a particular jaw, heavy and square. My father had it, my grandmother had it, I have it, and my sons will have it. Blair never had the Ashford chin. I used to think that was nothing. Under an office lamp at midnight, with my own jaw reflected faintly in the dark window, it stopped being nothing. I pulled the collateral lines, that's the term for the branches off to the side, the people who marry in, the friends who orbit a family for years. I went looking in the records of Wexford Harbour in the years around Blair's birth for anyone whose face matched the baby in that photograph better than my father's did. And a name surfaced. It surfaced the way names do when you finally ask the right question in a footnote, and then everywhere at once. A man named Perry Rennick, a friend of the family back then. In one old photograph, he stands at the edge of a garden party the summer before Blair was born, and he has a certain set to his brow, a certain colouring. And I put that photograph next to the baby picture, and I felt the floor tip again. The name kept pointing away from us. So, I built the case the way I'd build it for a stranger. I pulled the timeline first. Blair's birth record, my father's years reconstructed from the family's own papers, his travel, his long stretches away for the business. I set the likely date of conception against a season my father had spent 3,000 miles from Wexford Harbour. And the arithmetic did not work the way a family story is supposed to work. It is a strange, cold thing doing subtraction that unmakes a sister. Then I went back to Perry Rennick. I found him in a church register, a witness at a christening that year. I found him in a yacht club roster, a summer member the season before Blair was born and gone by the season after. I found him at the edge of 3 photographs, always near Constance, always half a step closer than a friend of the family stands. Each one alone was nothing. A christening, a membership, a man at a party, laid in a row in date order, they stopped being nothing and became a shape. None of it was proof. A resemblance is not proof. A timeline is not proof. A man at the edge of 3 photographs is not proof. But it was enough to tell me exactly which question the records would answer if I finally made them answer it. But a resemblance is not proof. And I do not deal in feelings. I deal in what can be documented. So I did the next thing, which was harder and quieter, and which I will not pretend was comfortable. I got the documentation. I won't walk you through all of it. What matters is this. There are ways when you know how records and testing work to establish whether two people share a father. I had my own line confirmed against a paternal Ashford sample from the estate. I am my father's daughter beyond question. And I had obtained carefully and privately what I needed to compare against Blair. The envelope with the result sat on my kitchen table for a full day before I opened it. I made the boys dinner around it. I helped with spelling homework 3 feet from it, a single sheet of paper, and I could not make my hands pick it up because I understood what it would say either way. If I was wrong, I'd spend a lifetime being an outsider for a reason, and I could go back to my folding chair and my gratitude. And if I was right, if this is right, I said out loud to an empty kitchen, everything they ever called me was backwards. I opened it that night after the boys were asleep. The paper was cold and stiff, and the edge of it left a thin white line across the pad of my thumb where I pressed too hard, and time did that thing it does at the worst and best moments, where it slows and thickens, so that I can still see the exact fold of the sheet and the exact angle of the lamp. The two of us, Blair and I, did not share a father. I am Edmund Ashford's daughter. Blair is not the Ashford blood. The blood they had built an entire cathedral of contempt around. The blood Constance invoked 4 times over one lunch. The blood I had been told my whole life I did not have enough of was never in Blair. It was in me, only ever in me. For 35 years, I wore a stain that was never mine. It was hers. Once I understood the blood, I understood the timing. That was the part that turned my stomach, sitting there with the result cooling on the table, because a lie is one thing. But I had spent months reading Constance as merely cruel. Cruel out of habit, cruel the way some people are simply cold. And now, with the date of the trust in one hand, and the truth of Blair in the other, the whole recent shape of her snapped into focus. And it was not habit. It was a clock. She wasn't being cruel for sport. She was running out of time. And once I saw the clock, the whole spring reorganized itself in front of me. The sudden warmth those last weeks. Constance calling me for the first time in years, asking after the boys by name, telling me how much the family valued everything I did. I'd taken it at the time for something finally thawing. Now I understood it was grease on a hinge she needed to swing. The push to settle your grandmother's affairs quickly, dear, so we can all move on. The offhand suggestion that the boys and I might be happier somewhere with better schools, a little further from town. The disclaimer in the sunroom, and the expensive pen. None of it had been the thing it looked like. Each one had been a hand at my back, steering me toward a door marked June, hoping I'd walk through it without reading the sign. She had spent that whole spring being kind to me for the first time in my life. And every kindness had a settlement date on it. My grandmother's legacy, the remainder of the Ashford holdings, would distribute in June, and it would distribute only after the trustee verified the Ashford line by blood. Constance knew better than anyone alive what that verification would find. She had known for 28 years exactly whose child Blair was. She had spent nearly 3 decades making sure the world called Blair the real Ashford, and called me the guest so that when the money finally moved, it would move to Blair without anyone thinking to test what everybody already believed. And here I was, the actual heir, the actual blood, inconveniently still standing, holding a deed to the house, and if I ever thought to ask for it, a claim to everything. So look again at what she'd been doing that spring and you'll see it wasn't temper. It was a woman trying to close a trap before June. 6 weeks before the cruise, Constance had asked me to sign something. I remember the moment now with a different weight than I felt it at the time. She'd caught me in the sunroom, warm and easy, with a single page and a pen, an expensive pen, cold and slick when she pressed it into my hand. Sign here, sweetheart. It's nothing. A wave of her fingers. Just tidying up the family paperwork before the estate settles. You know how these things pile up. I'd looked at the page. It was a disclaimer, a renunciation dressed up in soft language that would have had me formally give up any interest I might have in my grandmother's estate. Just a formality. Just my whole birthright signed away over coffee so that when June came, there'd be no one standing between Blair and the legacy. At the time I hadn't understood the whole of it, but I understood enough. I set the pen down on the table. I don't sign things I haven't read, I said. Her smile hadn't slipped. Constance's smile never slipped. But something behind it had gone very still. And now I knew what that stillness was. It was a woman watching a door she needed to close swing quietly back open. So when the text came the morning of the cruise, the twins, the seats, only real family, it landed differently on me than she could have possibly known. She thought she was putting a guest back in her place. She thought she was tightening the last screw before June, humiliating me small enough that I'd never dare raise my head at the distribution. She had no idea I was already holding the one thing that turned all of it inside out. And this is the part I've thought about most in the time since. I could have stopped her that spring. I could have walked into the sunroom with the letter and the result in one flat sentence and detonated the whole thing right there in private. I could have stopped her with one sentence. I let her keep talking. I let her send the text. I let her get on the plane. I let her sail off believing she'd won, because a truth like the one I was holding doesn't want a private room and a raised voice. It wants daylight and witnesses and the exact people who'd spent my whole life deciding what real meant. I could wait 10 days for that. So I signed my papers and I drove my boys out of town, and I let the clock she'd been racing run all the way down. Which brings us back to the cruise and to the plane that landed 10 days later on a family that thought it was coming home. The Ashford house has a long gravel drive, and I've been told you hear the sign before you see it. The way the real estate flag snaps in the wind off the harbour. They landed on a Saturday. I know the shape of what happened next because it came back to me from 3 different relatives who were there. Each of them still stunned. Each of them telling it like a thing they'd witnessed rather than a thing they'd allowed. The taxis pulled up the gravel drive, and Constance got out first, sun-pinked and easy from 10 days at sea, already reaching for keys that would have been in her bag. And there, planted in the flower bed by the gate she'd walked through for 30 years, angled toward the road so the whole street could read it, was a sign, sold. Beside the door, taped in a plastic sleeve against the weather, was a notice with a lawyer's letterhead, the residency license, expired by its own terms, and a date by which the occupants were to vacate. Clean, legal, final. Alistair Vance had served it himself, while they were somewhere over the Atlantic. Blair got out of the second car, and stood on the gravel, and read the sign twice, the way I'd read the text twice. And then she looked at her mother, and her mother had no face ready for her. They didn't get past the front hall. The house was still theirs to walk through for a few more days. I am not a monster and neither is the law. But the ground had shifted under it, and they knew it in their bodies before they knew it in their heads. That's when the phones came out. The 43 missed calls were on mine. They had started somewhere in the middle of the cruise when the first card was declined at a shop in port, and the first automatic payment bounced, and someone finally understood that the money had a source and the source had turned off. By the time they landed, my voicemail was full. I have kept them. I have listened to them more than once because they are in their way a confession. The early ones are all one register. How dare you? Constance's voice tight, the warmth entirely gone. That house is family property. You had no right. No right. Family property. She said it into my voicemail like a verdict. And it is the single most useful thing she ever recorded because it was a lie she believed. And the belief was about to meet a deed. The later ones change. You can hear the ground going soft under her. Adeline, please call me back. We can fix this. A breath? We are family. Whatever's upset you, we can fix it. 43 calls. I answered none. By the next morning, the register had changed a third time. From rage to pleading to strategy, because Constance, whatever else she was not a woman who stayed off balance for long. And she had already sent for her own lawyer. And her own lawyer had already done the one thing I knew he'd do the moment he heard the word trust. He pulled the recorded deed. And so she learned privately in her own front hall that the house had been legally mine for 2 years. That there was no theft to accuse me of, that her verdict, family property, was simply provably wrong. The house did not stay quiet that first night either. I heard about it later from Diane in the careful voice of a woman who had watched something she couldn't unsee. Blair had waited until the relatives cleared out, and then she'd stood in the front hall with the expired notice still taped to the door behind her, and she'd asked her mother one question, not about the house, about herself, about why the word real had been coming out of Constance's mouth her whole life, aimed at me, and whether it had ever once been aimed at the right person. Constance told her not to be hysterical. Diane said that was the moment she stopped believing her. Not when the sign went up, not when the deed came back, but when a mother answered her own daughter's fear with the word hysterical and reached for her phone instead of her child, which meant she couldn't fight me on the house. So, she chose the only ground she had left, the ground she'd stood on my entire life. She called the family together. The message went out to the whole clan, the aunts, the cousins, the yacht club friends, the whole assembly that had watched me sit in the folding chair for 30 years and never once asked why. A family meeting to address the message said what Adeline had done. Diane, the aunt who'd once asked if we were coming, called me herself, kind and shaken. You owe this family an explanation, Adeline, she said. And I could hear that she half believed it and half didn't, and that she wanted more than anything for there to be a version of this that made sense. There was. I'll come, I said. And then, because I had waited 10 days and a lifetime for exactly this room, the family meeting was held in the long drawing room of the Ashford house under my grandmother's portrait, and I want you to picture it because the room is the point. 24 people, the aunts on the good sofas, the cousins standing along the walls, the yacht club friends near the windows, the whole court of Ashford, the exact assembly that had spent my life deciding what real meant. Constance stood at the front by the cold fireplace, composed again, her lawyer at her shoulder. Blair sat to one side, pale, holding a cup of tea she never drank. I came in last with Alistair Vance beside me carrying a slim leather case, and I took a seat that was not the folding chair. Constance began before I was fully settled. She'd had a day to build it, and she'd built it well. I asked you all here, she said, and her voice was warm and grieving and pitched to carry. Because you deserve to know what's been done to this family. She turned her gaze on me, sorrowful. Adeline came to my mother-in-law when she was old and sick and alone, and she poisoned her. She turned a dying woman against her own blood. And now she sold the roof from over our heads, and put her own children ahead of the family that raised her. A soft, practiced catch. She was never really one of us. I think in your hearts you've always known that blood is blood. And this, all of this, belongs to real Ashfords. Heads turned toward me. I felt the old heat climb my neck, the exact heat from the card table from 100 dinners at the far end of the table. I let it come, then I let it go. I did not raise my voice. I'd like to start with the house, I said, because that part is simple. Vance opened the leather case. He didn't hand me a stack. He slid one document out and then another, laying them on the low table where the room could see, and the small, dry sounds of paper were the only sounds. This is the deed, I said. The house passed to me under my grandmother's trust the month she died, 2 years ago. It has been legally mine every day since. Every day I paid its taxes, every day you lived in it. I looked at Constance. A will names heirs. A trust already held this house. You were living here by my grandmother's grace. That grace expired in June. I didn't steal anything. I sold what was mine. Constance's lawyer leaned to murmur in her ear, and I watched her receive in public the thing she'd already received in private. That on the house, there was nothing to argue. So she did exactly what I knew she would. She reached for the only weapon she had ever needed. You can dress it up in paperwork, she said, and her voice hardened, the warmth burning off it. But you and I both know the truth. You were never a real Ashford. My mother-in-law was confused. This family runs in the blood, and you don't have it. The room shifted toward her because it was the old song, and they knew all the words. You want to make this about blood? I said. I stood up. Let's make it about blood. Vance opened the second folder. These are the vital records, I said. And I laid them out one at a time, and I named them as I did, because a receipt is only a receipt if the room can see it land. My birth record, my father's line, my grandmother's line, and this, I set down the last sheet, is a certified comparison establishing paternity. I am Edmund Ashford's daughter. Verified, documented. There is no question about my blood. A murmur started low, and my grandmother knew there'd be questions. I went on, and my voice stayed level and even, so she wrote it into the trust. The legacy, everything left in the estate, distributes only to Ashford descendants by blood, verified by the trustee this June. I looked at Vance and he nodded once, confirming, any claimant has to pass that verification to inherit anyone. I let the words sit in the room. Then I looked at my sister, who had not moved, whose tea had gone cold in her hands. And I was not cruel, because none of it was ever her fault. Blair carries no Ashford blood, I said quietly. She never did. The room stopped. The one you all called an outsider, I said into that stillness, is the only Ashford left in this room. Somewhere near the window, a cup met a saucer too hard, and then there was nothing. No murmur, no shifting, A silence so complete I could hear the harbor wind against the glass. Blair turned to her mother. Not to me, to her mother. And on Constance's face, for the first time in my entire life, I watched the smile fail. That's a lie, Constance said, and her voice cracked down the middle. That's a filthy lie. Then submit her for the verification, I said. The trust requires it in June regardless. Let the trustee test the line. I held her eyes. You've had 28 years to be sure, are you? And there it was. The thing I had waited 10 days and 35 years to watch happen in daylight. In front of the exact people it needed to happen in front of. She broke. I did what I had to do. It tore out of her. Loud, ragged. Nothing left of the powdered warmth. That house was supposed to be Blair's. It was all supposed to be hers. I made it hers. I gave her everything. I made her an Ashford. The room heard it. Every aunt, every cousin, every yacht club friend, who had spent 30 years nodding along to Blood is Blood heard her say in her own voice that she had made Blair one. Heard her own confession do what no document of mine ever could. Blair heard it too, and something in her face came apart, because she had just learned in a room full of strangers that she was the last to know whose child she was. I did not gloat. I have thought about that a great deal, and I want to be clear that it was not mercy. It was that gloating would have made it about me, and it was never about me. It was about a woman who built a lie out of my mother's memory, and my grandmother's silence, and then said the word real to my children in a sunroom. I picked up my grandmother's letter. I had brought it folded in my pocket, and I did not read it aloud because it was mine and hers and not for that room. I set a copy of the deed and the verification clause on the mantel instead, beneath my grandmother's portrait where Constance would find it when the room emptied and there was no one left to perform for. Then I did the one thing I had never once been allowed to do in that house. I chose when to leave. You were never a real Ashford, I said to her, and I did not call her Mom the way I had for 35 years of holidays and hallways. That word was a key, and she had spent my whole life telling me I hadn't earned the lock. So I set it down. You married one, and this was never yours to give. I picked up my case. Goodbye, Constance. I walked out through the front hall, past the folding chair someone had already brought in, and sat at the far end of the table out of pure habit, then out the door I'd once needed a heavy key to open. And I did not look back at the sign in the yard. If you've ever been the one at the far end of the table, the one who's tolerated, useful, told what real meant by people who were counting on you never checking, I want you to know this was never about a house. It was about who gets to decide you belong. Sit with that for a second, and if any part of this found you, tell me your own version below, and stay with the channel because there's a little more. And the last part is the part that matters. The new place has a window seat that catches the afternoon light, and that's where I found the cedar box, a home on the sill where the sun could reach it. The rest came apart quietly, the way these things do once the truth is out in a room that big. Constance did not submit Blair for the verification, which surprised no one. When June came, the trustee did his work, and the Ashford legacy passed the way my grandmother had written it, to Blood, and the blood was mine. I directed the largest part of it into a fund in my mother's name and my grandmother's, because it was never really money to me. It was the record finally corrected of who my mother had been and what had been taken from her. Constance kept the story she could carry, which grew smaller every week as the family did the math. The yacht club friends stopped calling her first. Diane called me first now. Blair called me once. It was a short call and a careful one, and neither of us pretended it fixed anything. She hadn't known. I believe that. I've always believed that she was a child handed a role, same as I was, just the opposite one. I told her the door was closed, but it wasn't slammed. And that if she ever wanted to know the real version of any of it, she knew where I was. That's as far as either of us could reach. And it was honest. And it was enough for now. I don't need them to call me real anymore. That's the thing that changed. And it changed the day I stopped waiting for the word and went and read the truth for myself. It's June as I tell you this, a warm one. The boys out of school, the harbour light long and gold in the evenings. Jonah found the acorn again last week, the little dark one, in the front pocket of the blue backpack, where I'd zipped it in on the morning we drove away. He held it up to the window, turning it, and the light caught the seams that I'd spent 30 years thinking were tarnish. "Is it a real one, Mom?" he asked. "It's so old." I took it from his palm and held it in mine, warm, the way I'd held it at 6, and I finally understood the whole of what my grandmother had done, that she'd given me the first one, the original, the one they'd cast all the shiny copies from, and let them laugh at it, and let me carry it, so that on some ordinary afternoon far in the future, I would know exactly which of us had always been real. "It's the realest one there is," I told him. "It came from our tree." I pulled out the chair beside me at the table, the good chair, the one by the window, and I patted it the way she used to, and Jonah climbed up without being told. Because in this house, that seat is always saved. "When autumn comes," I said, "I'll show you both something. There's a tree your great-grandmother loved, and every fall it drops these, and she taught me how to tell which ones came from it." I closed his small fingers around the acorn the way she'd closed mine. "This year, I'll teach you." Theo leaned into my other side. Outside, the light went from gold to rose over the water. The oak never asks the acorn to prove which branch it fell from. It just knows. And now, so do I. Living in the wake of the truth is a quieter, more profound experience than I ever expected. There is no longer the constant, background noise of needing to justify my existence, or my place at the family table. The Ashford house, once a site of daily, exhausting performance, is now just a distant memory, a landmark I sometimes drive past on my way to the harbour, noting how the new owners have painted the shutters a colour that doesn't quite suit the architecture. I don't feel a sting when I see it. It is just wood and stone, finally stripped of the suffocating history that Constance tried to impose upon it. My boys are thriving in a home where they don't have to navigate seating charts or earn their grandmother's approval. They are growing up knowing that the only thing that makes someone real is the integrity they bring to their own life. They are rooted in a version of family that doesn't rely on bloodlines or ironclad deeds, but on the simple, radical act of showing up. Alistair Vance, the man who had been my grandmother's quiet sentinel for decades, became a regular fixture in our lives for a short time after the settlement. He wasn't the piece of furniture my family had dismissed, he was a man of immense, hidden depth. He showed me the private files my grandmother had kept, not just legal papers, but personal musings, letters she had written to me over the years that she never had the courage to send. In them, she spoke of the loneliness of being the only one who saw the truth, and how she had poured her love for me into those silent, small acts, like pressing the acorn into my hand. Reading those letters, I realized that my grandmother hadn't just been kind, She had been engaged in a 30-year-long act of resistance against Constance's erasure. She had been protecting my reality, while I was still too young to understand what was being stolen from me. I decided to use a significant portion of the estate not to expand my own footprint, but to create a foundation in my mother's name. My mother, Rosalind, had died with almost no record of her existence in that house. I was going to ensure that her name stood for something permanent. The Rosalind Ashford Foundation focuses on supporting young mothers who are struggling to find their footing, providing them with the exact kind of resources I wished my mother had possessed. Every time I sign a check or attend a board meeting for the foundation, I feel a sense of profound closure. It is my way of balancing the scales, of ensuring that the history my family tried to bury is instead used to build a path for someone else. As I watch my boys grow, I realize that the most important thing I can do for them is to refuse to participate in the games of people who don't respect them. I built a life that I don't have to defend to anyone, and that is the greatest legacy I could have ever asked for. The story of the Ashford house was over, and the story of the Ashfords, the real ones, the ones built on blood, truth, and chosen love, is just beginning.